But let's begin with this news today from Moderna. How promising is it?
Well, it's certainly encouraging. They looked at 45 patients. They had data on 45 patients and 3 different doses of the vaccine they studied. And all of the patients, they were able to develop antibodies. And in 8 of the patients that they evaluated, those were neutralizing antibodies, meaning that they're antibodies that will actually target the virus itself and neutralize it. In the other patients, we don't yet have data on whether or not those antibodies are neutralizing antibodies. We just know that they bound the virus. But it's certainly encouraging data. And we also know that they are zeroing in on a dose as well. The 250 microgram dose that they tested seems to have produced too many fevers in patients. They seem to have abandoned that dose. Based on what they said early this morning to Meg Terrell on morning show on CNBC. And it appears that the 25 microgram dose that they tested as well didn't produce as robust a response. They don't appear to be taking that forward. So now they're taking forward their 100 microgram dose and now a new 50 microgram dose. And so they're narrowing in on what the proper dose of this vaccine should be as well. And that's encouraging also.
What are the critical next steps that we have to keep our eye on now? We know in the past, phase 1 doesn't always mean that this has a positive ending.
Right. This is still very early. We don't know whether or not this is going to provide protective immunity. We don't know what the durability of the immunity is. And we certainly don't know the safety profile of the product. Some critical next steps are figuring out what the dose is. So they have to do some phase 2 work, probably multiple phase 2 studies to figure out what the right dose is of this vaccine. And then there's a lot of complexity in going from manufacturing a vaccine for a clinical trial to doing large-scale manufacturing that would be required for commercialization of a product. A lot of things can go wrong. There's a lot of complexity as you switch over to commercial-scale manufacturing. That's one of the hardest things to do in the vaccine business. And so they haven't even begun to do that yet. And so there's a lot of things left that they need to traverse here. But the next critical step for them will be conducting phase 2 studies to try to figure out what the optimal dose is, and also turning over the card on whether or not the vaccine is consistently producing neutralizing antibodies, which would imply that it's conferring some level of immunity.
How do we get to the point where we know how long the antibodies actually last, though we know they are being produced?
Well, it's probably going to require 2 doses. Most of the vaccines that are being developed will probably require 2 doses to get a sufficient amount of antibodies to be protective. And it's probably going to be the case that these antibodies won't be protective for many years. This might be an annual injection that we get, like the flu vaccine, where you go every year and you get a vaccine for the flu and you get a vaccine for coronavirus. There are some vaccines in development, like the one that J&J is working on and the one that AstraZeneca just partnered on, that use an adenoviral vector approach that may elicit cell-based immunity that may be longer lasting. But these mRNA vaccines may require more frequent dosing, annual vaccines, or something maybe a little less frequent than that. But I suspect it could be an annual vaccine. Same with the vaccine being developed by Sanofi, which is a protein vaccine approach. There's multiple different kinds of approaches being taken. Different vaccines are going to have pros and cons with them.
What about the ability to ramp and really get to scale? We're talking, the company was talking 100 million doses a year, if not more than that. Is that realistic?
Well, that's the hard part. There's a lot of complexity right now in taking this through development and making sure you can demonstrate that it's safe and effective in large-scale clinical trials, and conducting those trials is complex. But being able to make the vaccine in a way that it can be manufactured at scale, so engineer the vaccine in a way that it can be manufactured at these very large scales that are needed, is highly complex. And there's been a lot of problems with that in the past. In 2009 with H1N1, as we went from the experimental doses of the vaccine into large-scale commercialization with that vaccine, I was involved with this at the time, we weren't getting the same yield that we thought we would be getting, and we ended up getting actually less vaccine stock, less vaccine antigen, and that set us back a couple of months. And so producing the vaccines in a way where you're getting a sufficient yield to produce the doses that you think you're going to need, that's highly complex, and making that transition isn't easy, and you need a company that has experience in that. In this case, Moderna has partnered with a contract manufacturer by the name of Lonza to do some of that work, and hopefully they're developing this vaccine with an eye towards what can be produced at scale.
There is another very big story developing tonight, Dr. Gottlieb, and that is a revelation that the president has been taking hydroxychloroquine and zinc. He said he's been taking it for about a year and a half. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I didn't hear you said he was taking it for a year, a week and a half.
Excuse me, I misspoke.
Right. Right. Well, look, I mean, early on in the course of this epidemic, I know some doctors were taking it off-label prophylactically. Most physicians that I know have pulled away from doing that. I don't know that people are taking it prophylactically anymore, in large measure because the data that's accrued hasn't really demonstrated that the drug is having a robust treatment effect or that it's preventing people from getting infected. A lot of doctors in Italy were anecdotally taking hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin in combination, and they were still getting infected. And so there just hasn't been good data to suggest that there's a treatment effect here or that these drugs in combination can prevent the infection. I would say that I would hope that the president's in a protective bubble where they're testing people who are in contact with him and where he's being monitored closely enough that he wouldn't be at high risk of contracting COVID, and therefore the utility of taking any kind of prophylactic drug would probably be very low in a situation like that. He's probably at low risk. But, you know, I'll leave the judgment about what he's taking and why to him and his physician.
How surprised, though, were you when you first heard this news? I think we were all somewhat stunned by the revelation.
Well, look, I was surprised insofar as I think the president is very well protected. I know people who are visiting with the president have to get tested before they visit with him. White House staff is being tested on a regular basis, and that's been in the public domain, so we know that. And, you know, they're practicing good social distancing around the president. And so he should be at very low risk. And so even if there was a drug that was effective at preventing infection, which there isn't one that's been demonstrated safe and effective for that purpose. But even if there was, I would hope that the president wouldn't be an optimal candidate for that just because he's being protected very well. I want to believe that the president's being protected, that he's in a protective bubble, and that people who are infected aren't going to come into contact with the president of the United States.